folks, Jeffrey Epstein was on a whole nother level. This is part 2 of our ongoing series for Behind the Deep State on Jeffrey Epstein, who was obviously far more than just a perverted child sex trafficking criminal megalomaniac. There are so many different angles we could explore. Last episode, we did part 1 on Jeffrey Epstein. We just kind of did a quick overview. And in the weeks to come, we're going to look at all different elements of this individual, what we're learning through these documents that are finally being released, millions of pages of documents. But today we want to focus in on one connection in particular. For years now, since I've been doing this program, Behind the Deep State for the New American, I wanted to do an episode on the Rothschild dynasty. I don't think you can understand the deep state without understanding the Rothschild dynasty. And frankly, I wrote about them extensively in my book about the deep state. They are, I put them in the chapter on deep state money men, and they are really the epitome of deep state money men. So last week, we mentioned briefly that Epstein was paid a $25 million fee through the Rothschild organizations to his Southern Trust Company. And this $25 million went to the quote-unquote work with a capital W. Now, digging into this, it seems to be some vague references to risk management and consulting, whatever that's supposed to mean. But we're going to look through some of the emails between Jeffrey Epstein and the Rothschilds today to see if we can figure out more about what was going on. We also talked about how Epstein was actually presenting himself as a representative of the Rothschilds. He wrote an example, for example, in an email to Peter Thiel, the tech billionaire, founder of Palantir, which is a critical part of the deep state architecture of control that's being imposed on us right now. It's hard to tell where Palantir ends and the federal government begins. That's how close they are. Peter Thiel's got minions all up and down the federal government at the highest levels. In fact, and this is going to step on a few toes, but he was really the leading financier of J.D. Vance, right? He is the ultimate tech bro, co-founder of the PayPal mafia, hardcore transhumanist, huge player in the emerging technocratic system that's being imposed on us. And when Epstein reached out to him, he said, as you probably know, I represent the Rothschilds. So who are the Rothschilds, right? That they seem to be so high up. Well, if you read these documents again, you'll see lots of connections to the Rothschild dynasty. But before we get into those specifically, a lot of people have been talking about Epstein's work with intelligence agencies, and we'll come back to that. It's a very important angle here. But if you've looked at my book, Deep State, the Invisible Government Behind the Scenes, we have a whole chapter on the intelligence agencies, but really they ought to be regarded not as the deep state, which is what some narratives would have us believe, that the CIA is the deep state, right? It's much more than that. I actually regard the intelligence agencies as kind of the operational arm of the deep state. And I think that's the best way to understand them. Now, it is true that Epstein was connected to a lot of intelligence agencies. He was clearly connected, as we see from the documents, as we knew before, to the Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, we've got a document confirming from the U.S. government that he was working with and for the U.S. government. He was connected to the MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the United Kingdom. He was connected to the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service. He was connected to Chinese intelligence, and we're going to do more on that. This is a hugely significant connection. And we're going to come back now because the Rothschilds have also been intimately involved with China, as have many other key deep state players. It might even be connected to the KGB. The Polish government is currently doing an investigation on that very thing right now. A lot of Russian girls. So we'll see what comes out of that. But clearly, Epstein was connected with a lot of intelligence organizations. But also clearly, he wasn't like a minion for them, right? He was above that. He was operating on a whole level beyond these so-called intelligence agencies. And it just goes to kind of confirm the thesis in my book. By the way, we're releasing an updated second edition here very soon. But there's a deep state behind the deep state, right? The CIA, the bureaucracies, this is not the deep state. The real deep state are some of these organizations that Epstein was involved in. We talked about the Trilateral Commission in our last episode on Epstein, Bilderberg. Obviously, Rothschilds are huge players in Bilderberg, along with Rockefellers and other very, very wealthy families. But when you look at the money side of the deep state, you have to conclude that Rothschilds are pretty close to the top of the pyramid, right? It's just unbelievable how many things they are involved in. And so this is a great opportunity to finally talk a little bit about the Rothschilds. I've been wanting to do that for a very long time. One reason the Rothschilds don't get talked about a lot is because, of course, they don't like publicity. Another one is because there are, I think, very genuine concerns about anti-Semitism. I personally regard anti-Semitism as dangerous, very bad. And I think we need to be clear here. Talking about the Rothschilds as representatives of all Jews is preposterous, right? The Rothschilds are not representatives of all Jews any more than the Rockefellers are representatives of all Baptists any more than, and it's not anti-Semitic to talk about Rothschilds any more than it's anti-Baptist to talk about Rockefellers, right? And in fact, I'd go a step further. I would argue that if you look at the kinds of schemes that the Rockefellers, that the Bill Gateses, that the George Soros, that the Rothschilds and Rockefellers are involved in, they're not really believing Jews or Baptists or Presbyterians or Congregations or Catholics or anything like that, right? Clearly, they have abandoned the morality that God revealed first to Moses on Mount Sinai, later expanded upon in the New Testament. Clearly, they have no affection or entanglement with the moral order that God gave us. So let's talk a little bit about the Rothschilds. They have funded outcomes of wars for a very long time. They actually specialized for centuries in bankrolling governments, especially when those governments were involved in wars. And to get a sense of how powerful this dynasty was, you need to recognize the power that they have with their money to control the outcomes of wars. And so actually an apologist for them, this is a fascinating story. Niall Ferguson is kind of like a court historian for the establishment. He wrote a book called The World's Banker, The History of the House of Rothschild. And in this very interesting book, he says something fascinating. He says that the Rothschilds had decided the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars by putting their financial weight behind Britain. I mean, let that sink in for a minute. Okay, here we are. The two most powerful governments in the world, the French government and the British government, are fighting each other to the death. And the determining factor in how that battle goes, according to a court historian who likes the Rothschilds, who's basically an apologist for the Rothschilds, that war was decided by the Rothschilds putting their financial weight behind Britain. Imagine having the power to decide an outcome between the two most powerful governments in the world. And then imagine that people don't even talk about this family. And the family's still around today, as we will see. Gary Allen, the author of None Dare Call It Conspiracy, explained in his book that during our American Civil War, the North was financed by the Rothschilds through their American agent, a gentleman by the name of August Belmont, and the American South through the Erlangers, Rothschild relatives. So that's something we see repeatedly with this family. They like to finance both sides of wars. And if you look at their, basically the system that they perfected, their banking dynasty in Europe, really their specialty was government bonds, right? Loans to government. So they had a vested interest in the outcome of wars, but they found out that loaning money to governments was very, very profitable. Now, in his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, the great G. Edward Griffin, who's a friend of mine, whose board I serve on, he actually wrote this book for Western Islands, the Creature from Jekyll Island. He talks about the Rothschilds, and he actually argues that the Rothschilds were critical players in the creation of the Federal Reserve. He points to Paul Warburg, who was a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company, as basically the American representatives of the Rothschild banking dynasty. And also the brother Marx Warburg, the head of the banking consortium for the Warburgs in Germany and the Netherlands. So Griffin lists all these different bankers, these participants, and he says they were representatives, basically, of the world's leading banking consortia. He talks about the Morgans, he talks about the Rockefellers, talks about the Rothschilds, and talks about the Warburgs. So the Rothschilds, clearly big players. Ed actually has a chapter in his book called The Rothschild Formula, where he argues that the Rothschilds were the one who kind of pioneered this strategy of profiting from war by financing both sides of the conflict and then basically getting everybody enslaved to perpetual debt. The formula basically is you stir up wars, you finance both sides, and then you make money. Now, the Rothschilds have also funded a lot of the key players in the deep state. I mean, if you ask a well-informed conservative American who are the key money men of the deep state, you'll hear names like Cecil Rhodes. You'll hear names like George Soros. Well, both of those, Cecil Rhodes and George Soros, actually trace their wealth and their fortunes right back to the Rothschilds. If you look at Cecil Rhodes, Incredible story. First of all, I should say Cecil Rhodes was disgusting. There's a lot of evidence that he may have even been a homosexual pedophile. If you look at BBC's 1996 dramatization, Rhodes, The Life and Legend of Cecil Rhodes, they literally portray Rhodes as a pedophile. And there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that. He never married, never had any children that we know of, and had some weird proclivities, like watching African boys in the mines as they worked naked, just weird stuff. Now, in his own book, he wrote a book called Confessions of Faith, and we talked to the great Curtis Bowers about this recently. He said, and this book was 1877, he said that he joined the Masonic order, and when he came to his house, he's had this vision. And he said he basically had this idea that we needed the financial, the political, the religious unification of the world under a global system, kind of an Anglo-Saxon global empire. And obviously the Rothschilds seemed to agree with that agenda. And so the Rothschilds provided major backing to Cecil Rhodes, the Rothschild banking family through N.M. Rothschild and Sons in London, and also Rothschild Frères, the Rothschild brothers in Paris, gave huge amounts of funding for Rhodes's mining ventures in southern Africa. They actually financed in the late 1800s the creation of the De Beers Mining Company, which basically became a monopoly, or close to it, on the world's diamond supply. They financed also for Rhodes the British South Africa Company, again, also South Africa, mining funded by the Rothschilds. They ended up colonizing these territories that eventually became Rhodesia, right? Yes, Cecil Rhodes had a country named after him. Today it's Zimbabwe, basically, and parts of Zambia. And so their goal was to secure all these minerals in southern Africa. And then they used all of this money for incredibly wicked purposes. Of course, you've heard of the Rhodes scholarships, but Rhodes also set up the round table groups. We'll talk about that, kind of concentric circles of influence, where the whole goal was under this one world system. Rhodes actually referred to Nathaniel Rothschild, later Lord Rothschild, as a key confidant, and in his will, he left basically his estate to Nathaniel Rothschild to administer. Basically told him to create the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, one of the other things that Rhodes did was set up the Society of the Elect, and so many of the subversive movements, subversive societies that we've seen actually trace their roots back to this. And if you go to Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, the incredible book by Georgetown University historian Carroll Quigley. This was Bill Clinton's mentor. He actually says he agrees with this agenda, this global economic and political order that they're trying to create, but he thinks that their role ought to be known rather than be secret. And we did a whole episode on Quigley spilling the beans. And he gives some really, really important revelations. And one of them is about Cecil Rhodes and these roundtable groups. And of course, the American branch of this all was the Council on Foreign Relations, which is very, very critical to understand. You also have George Soros, right? Yes, George Soros, the billionaire, anti-American zealot, totalitarian, got his start again with the Rothschilds. The Banque Privée, which was the Swiss bank operation of Baron Edmund de Rothschild, actually is where George Soros got his money for his quantum fund going back to 1969. And this came out in the Washington Times, right? An original $100,000 into Mr. Soros's fund ended up being worth $150 million by 1994. And so if you look at that, between 1970 and 2000, we read in the Washington Times, that was a rate of return of 3,365%. Okay. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing. Now, when you understand that this is where Soros got his start, and when you understand, and by the way, Soros was convicted of insider trading in a French court, right? So it's not like this guy's just like super business wizard. He just knows how to make money. No. They are up to no good. They understand that insider trading is one of the great ways to make money. Now, this quantum fund actually had on its board Richard Kotz, who was the head of Rothschild Italia, so the Italian division of the Rothschild Empire. He also had Niels Taube, a partner in St. James Place Capital, right alongside, yes, Lord Rothschild, frequent collaborator with Sir James Goldsmith, a relative of the Rothschild in Soros's gold speculations. So, folks, it's just never ending, right? These connections between the Rothschilds and the deep state. And so then to go back to Epstein now, how interesting to find all of these emails between Rothschilds, mostly Ariane de Rothschild, who's the CEO of the Rothschild Group, took over from her late husband, Benjamin. but also other Rothschilds, right? So we've got huge payments. We talked about the $25 million payment through the Southern Trust Company. Another $45 million payment is discussed in some of these emails. And you see this very friendly email correspondence between Ariane de Rothschild and Epstein. And I mean, just about all kinds of issues, right? Like in the 2014 revolution in Ukraine, which, by the way, the U.S. government, as you know, played a critical role in stirring that up. Epstein emails Rothschild and says, Ukraine upheaval should provide many opportunities. Many. Wonder what that means, right? Are they talking about opportunities for money? Are they talking about sicker things, right? We know from some of the emails about the trafficking of girls that Epstein would take advantage anywhere he could to get his hands on girls, underage, minors, children, for trafficking, for lending out to others, for blackmail purposes. It's absolutely gross. And by the way, all this is way after Epstein was busted for his child sex trafficking activities. The guy literally pled guilty to soliciting prostitution from a minor. And so in 2016, Epstein wrote to Rothschild, the Silicon Valley boys will be here today to discuss how to make money in the future. Any ideas that you would like to bounce off of them? Interesting. Wonder who the Silicon Valley boys are. Ariane de Rothschild responds by telling Epstein to discuss disruptive tech and trends that would reshape the world, like migration flows. Now, we'll come back to Ariane, but another message, this one to Alexander de Rothschild. Epstein gives some business advice. He says operations of the bank, you need a new advisory board, Summers, Ehud, Pritzker, he gives some names there. No diplomats, not African, serious people, strong finance, operation reputation, not charity, preferably some Jews. So very interesting here that Epstein, a child sex trafficker, is giving business advice to the most powerful banking dynasty in the history of the world. Epstein also orchestrated a lot of meetings between Rothschilds and key people like Ehud Barak, former president of Israel, who, by the way, does not get along with the current prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. September 2013 email to Joshua Cooper Ramo. This is the vice chairman of Kissinger Associates. Yes, the consulting firm of globalist Henry Kissinger, kind of a poodle of the Rockefeller dynasty. He recruited Klaus Schwab to do the World Economic Forum. And Epstein says, I think a meeting with Ehud Barak and the Rothschilds separately. I trust your judgment, Ramos responded. So Les Wexner, this multi-billionaire based in Ohio, used to own Victoria's Secret, Bed Bath & Beyond, Abercrombie & Fitch. He's actually been named by the FBI as a co-conspirator with Epstein, one of the few living individuals who has actually been fingered by the FBI. And on February 18th, this guy who, by the way, by his own admission, had some kind of demon that he talked about decades ago, he says to the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform when he was being deposed that Epstein did, in fact, have a personal connection to the Rothschilds. Check it out.
Done personal work for the Rothschild family in France. Well, specifically, I talked to Elie de Rothschild, and so I mentioned that earlier. So he represented their whole family. So there had been a whole bunch of people. I mean, most of them I never would have met, but I knew Elie. He would say, like, I'm providing financial advice to the founders of Google.
And, if you go back and you look at the history of the Rothschilds, basically Mayer Amschel Rothschild set up this dynasty. He deployed his 5 sons to different parts of Europe, to Frankfurt and to London and to Paris. And they basically set up banking houses there. Incredible network that they created. They really revolutionized finance. And here you have Epstein right smack in the middle of it. So in this 2015 exchange, Ariane's like, did you see David's announcement that he was renaming his group Rothschild and Company? So they talk about this legal dispute. Epstein responds, oh, yes, predictable. I described your lawsuit as toothless and much more not very nice. Told others that Nadine and Benjamin are leaning towards him rather than you. Nadine removing money, etc. So there's a very, very interesting exchange here where they're kind of, Ariane says, yes, I'm thinking about it, building energy for the next rounds. Kathy got the lawsuit. Then there's a different email chain, same subject. Epstein writes to Ariane, I think you should task Kathy with trying to solve the David issue. Let her negotiate on your behalf. And Ariane responds, here's a great one for you. Benjamin's answer to his absence from boards. It was a chosen strategy to give me space and to force board members to respect me. Why not? Epstein says, Not bad. However, he cannot handle a hostile deposition where all questions about the bank and his knowledge will be on the table, since the case is about unfair practice goes slow. So really interesting exchange here that you see. This dispute continues all the way into 2017. Epstein writes to Ariane, "I will not transmit any of cousin's vitriol as it seems to upset you. No guilt is my new mantra." Ariane says, "The vitriol is only additional fuel to my determination. I absolutely hate unfairness, and they are a dead breed." And then there's a really interesting remark that I want to focus in on here. Epstein says, "I'm organizing our Cuba trip for November, probably 17th through 19th. Lots to see, no guilt." Epstein says, "Yes, I will organize. We will be hosted by Castro family." Yes, you read that right. You heard that right. By the Castro family. But we'll take trips into areas of unreal beauty. Cuba is 1,000 kilometers long. Will you be in Paris, et cetera, et cetera? And she says, "I look forward to it." Ariane responds, "I look forward to it. Do you want me to host Woody Allen at home?" So I want to dig into this for a minute, folks, because the Rothschilds and many other key deep state players have a lot of interesting connections with the communist movement. In fact, some years ago, I did an article when Baron Erich de Rothschild was openly supporting Bulgarian Communist Party operative, who we had spent a lot of time exposing. Her name was Irina Bokova. She was the head of UNESCO. Literally, her dad was on the Politburo of the Bulgarian Communist Party. She served as foreign minister for a communist regime that slaughtered hundreds of thousands of innocent people. And Baron Erich de Rothschild was publicly supporting her to lead the United Nations, to serve as Secretary General for the United Nations. And so I want to go back now briefly to Tragedy and Hope before we keep digging into as many emails as we have time for. Carol Quigley writes in his book that the powers of financial capitalism, he's talking about this Anglo-American establishment, had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. He says the system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret meetings and conferences. Again, the very kinds of secret meetings and conferences that Rothschilds and Epstein and Rockefellers are all right involved in. And he says the apex of the system would be the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which are themselves, of course, private corporations. And there's an incredible nugget in this book. It says, there does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. This network, which we may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists, and frequently does so. That's very interesting, right? And we've talked about this before. It's very, very interesting. And what we see is Rothschilds here going to Cuba to be hosted by Fidel Castro. We see Rothschilds supporting communists to lead the United Nations. In fact, I want to show you some clips of one of the patriarchs of the Rothschild dynasty, who is no longer with us. But here he is on the news talking about, you guessed it, the wonders and the glories of the most ruthless and brutal communist dictatorship ever in the history of the world. Here it is.
The Rothschild joins us now to talk about investing in China and his latest venture, Weather Central, here as well. So, Evelyn, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to get your views on how things have evolved. Has it become a more open society? Has it become an easier place to do business?
Oh, I think it is, no doubt. I think it's a remarkable country. When you think of what has happened in the last 10 years, let alone 20 years, is an achievement beyond recognition.
An achievement beyond recognition, right? And now, speaking of the CCP, here he is again.
So, Evelyn, what about the RMB situation? You mentioned a so-called currency problem. I mean, do you see the day in the next 5 years where it's fully convertible and flexible?
Well, you're talking to a person who's quite old. If I'm around in 5 years, I'd like to think that that is the case. I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency.
An international currency, right? Run by essentially the CCP and friends. This is where they're ultimately going with this, folks, as we've talked about. And as you can see, these super capitalists allegedly openly and frequently cooperating with, collaborating with communists. It's absolutely incredible. And yet, if you read the book, The Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, what you'll find is that Wall Street was deeply involved in funneling money to the Bolshevik Revolution, including a lot of mega wealthy banks with ties to the Rothschild dynasty. So there's so many more emails in here, folks. You have at the end of 2015, Edmund D. Rothschild Group was in trouble, and so they were being looked at by the U.S. Department of Justice for helping wealthy Americans hide their money from the tax man. And you have Ariane de Rothschild again asking Jeffrey Epstein and a lawyer that he had introduced her to, Kathy Rumler, to close this deal. So $45 million goes to Epstein. Epstein replies that you got 10 million fee for the lawyers, 25 million for him, $45 million fine. And Ariane says, deep thanks for your amazing help. Okay. And just days after these emails, you get the DOJ announcement of a $45 million settlement, and presto, it all goes away. Nothing more to see here, folks. So you've got an email that seems to be about her husband who died in 2021. Ariane says that B. Benjamin is out of control, inverting situation, totally paranoiac. Some really personal stuff, right? I mean, you're airing the family's dirty laundry with this guy. Clearly, he's not just like a consultant or an advisor of some sort, right? And Epstein responds, he says, I can come to Geneva or Paris next week when you return. So very, very interesting, right? You've got Epstein gossiping about this failing marriage with Kathy Rumler, the attorney we talked about. She was White House counsel for the Obama administration. Epstein says, do you think Bill Clinton would like to join you, me, Ehud, obviously Ehud Barak, and Steve? Could be very funny, all off the record. And Rumler responds, well, he might like to. His lawyer would advise him against. Are you feeling better? Epstein says, only slightly. Ariane said, Ben, giving her a very hard time, did not know about tattoo. And Rumler says, what is Benjamin about? And Epstein says, she said he wants her to do lifelike things. Ugh. I mean, these are very personal conversations. By the way, Rumler just resigned as the top lawyer for Goldman Sachs over her involvement with Epstein. Folks, there are so many more of these, right? You've got Ariane going back and forth with Jeffrey Epstein on all kinds of things. It seems to be a reference to Noam Chomsky. I mean, wow, there's no way we're going to have time to go through all these. In 2016, Epstein sends in a link to a New York Times article to Ariane about a Malaysian scandal with the Sovereign Asian Wealth Fund. They called it the 1MDB scandal. And of course, Rothschild was implicated in that. They ended up paying a $25 million settlement just last year for their role in that. There's weird references to Hitler, right? Epstein sends an email to Ariane. I thought you'd find it amusing that in a Harvard class on Hitler, they told the story of when Hitler was so poor he lived in a shelter for the homeless and destitute that had been financed by three wealthy families, the Gutmans, the Epsteins, and the Rothschilds. Epstein says it turns out to be very accurate. Rothschild responds, whether a way to say that generosity is not rewarded or that the conspiracy still exists is quite pathetic. Epstein responds, first, it turns out to be 100% true. Hitler was selling his clothes and artwork and living in a shelter funded by Jews. Epstein, Rothschild, and Gutman. No conspiracy. The Epsteins were the Vienna bankers, bought the bank on the ring, hence still Palais Epstein. And Rothschild says, I know it's true, but regularly used to say that the Rothschilds planned and supported Hitler and mass destruction to gain more power. So anyways, folks, it gets really, really bad. And I just want to encourage you folks. And Ariane also sending little gifts to Epstein. One, she says, a customized candle. Your favorite mathematical formula is written on it. The smell is made for you only. It fits with your island. Creepy stuff, folks. This ought to be a wake-up call, folks. Epstein was clearly a top-level player, and you get some incredible insight into how the deep state really works. So join us for the next part of this series coming very soon, where we're going to look into Epstein's support for transhumanism and his links to academia. It's creepy beyond what you can imagine. I'm Alex Newman. This is Behind the Deep State for The New American. Get over to thenewamerican.com. Thanks for watching, and God bless you all.